War Sovereign Soaring the Heavens, Chapter 783. In next to no time, Feng Wu Dao and Sword 13 left Suli's room successively. Only Duan Ling Tian, Feng Tian Wu, Zhang Xiaoyang, and Suli remained in the room. The gazes of Duan Ling Tian's group of three descended simultaneously onto Suli. They had too many questions in their hearts that urgently required Suli's answers. Suli, Senior said earlier that the Blade sect wants half of the young experts that become eminent in the martial competition of the 10 dynasties. What did he mean by that? Duan Ling Tian asked curiously. He kept having the feeling that when Sword 13 said those words, it was absolutely not simply that the Blade sect wanted to compete for disciples with Skywolf Fort. I don't know either. Suli laughed bitterly. I only know that Master asked me to participate in the martial competition of the 10 dynasties, and he would take me back to Blade sect once the martial competition ended. Even though Suli had become the disciple of Sword 13 for a period of time already, he'd never returned to the Blade sect with Sword 13. Then what about the Baldies your master mentioned earlier? Why did it cause the expression of Skywolf Fort's Vice Fort Master to darken? Are those Baldies so terrifying? Feng Tianwu asked. Actually, I'm not really clear about those Baldies either. I've only heard Master mention that those Baldies represent a power of the foreign lands that isn't inferior to our Blade sect. Suli spoke with slight helplessness as what he knew was too little. We can be sure that there's surely a reason why the Skywolf Fort held this martial competition of the 10 dynasties suddenly. Moreover, that reason caused the Blade sect and another power of the foreign lands that isn't inferior to the Blade sect to pay attention to it. Zhang Xiaoyang guessed. His guess obtained the unanimous agreement of Duan Ling Tian's group of three. Right, Suli, why is your master called Sword 13? It's probably not his real name, right? Feng Tianwu asked curiously. Duan Ling Tian and Zhang Xiaoyang looked at Suli as well, and they had the same question in their hearts. Sword 13 didn't seem like a regular name, and it seemed more like a code name. I know the answer to this. Suli said, because I've asked Master this question once. According to Master, there's a tradition in our Blade sect. The Master of the House of Blades and House of Swords in the Blade sect had to be chosen from an extremely horrifying selection. Moreover, a selection like that would be held every 30 years. During that selections, no matter if it was the House of Sabers or House of Swords, both of them would carefully select 18 outstanding disciples that had the intention of becoming the sect master. From the moment these outstanding disciples of the House of Sabers agree to undergo the selection, their past names would cease to exist, and only a new name would remain. It would respectfully be Saber 1, Saber 2, Saber 3, until Saber 18. As he spoke up to here, Suli paused for a moment. For example, Long Yun's master is precisely Saber 5 of the current generations, and in another few years, he'll officially take over as master of the House of Sabers in the Blade sect. Suli looked at Duan Ling Tian as he spoke. Long Yun's master? Duan Ling Tian's brows raised, and he was slightly surprised. He was naturally familiar with Long Yun. The Saber young master of the formed 5 great young masters of the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom and the foster son of the demonic Lotus Blade sect's leader, Long Wei, and Long Yun could be considered to be half an enemy to him. Of course, after he killed Long Wei, they could already be considered to be true enemies. Once Long Yun found out that he'd killed Long Wei, Long Yun would surely wish for nothing more than to fight him to the death. Originally, after he crushed Long Yun in the martial competition of the 5 great sect of the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom, Duan Ling Tian had never taken Long Yun seriously any longer. Because he felt that Long Yun would be left far behind by him and was nothing to be feared. Only when the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom held the genius competition and he saw Long Yun once more was he unable to refrain but be greatly shocked. At that time, Long Yun seemed as if he'd been reborn, and a tremendous change had occurred on him. Even though Long Yun was still inferior to him, he wasn't much inferior to him. Later on, he'd obtained fortuitous encounters in succession, allowing his strength to advance by leaps and bounds, whereas, Long Yun's strength still followed neither swiftly nor slowly behind him, and this caused him to be filled with admiration towards the fortuitous encounter behind Long Yun. According to his knowledge, Long Yun's fortuitous encounter was similar to Suli's, and both of them had a master that came from the foreign lands. Moreover, their masters were from the same sect. Suli called Long Yun's master as Martial Uncle Saber, and Long Yun called Suli's master as Martial Uncle Sword. At that time, Duan Lingtian was slightly puzzled when they addressed their masters in that way. Do people address their seniors like that? Now he came to an understanding. One was called Saber 5, the other was called Sword 13, how else would they address them? So in this way, your master is representing the Blade Sect's master? Duan Lingtian asked. Yes. Suli nodded. Long Yun's master, Saber 5, is the one and only disciple amongst the 18 disciples from the House of Sabers that passed through the selection and survived. The other 17 House of Sabers disciples are dead. It can be said that Saber 5 stepped on the corpses of those 17 House of Sabers disciples to possess his current status and accomplishments. As he finished speaking, Suli couldn't help but sigh. Duan Lingtian naturally knew why Suli was sighing. Because Suli's master, Sword 13, was the same, he'd stepped on the corpses of the 17 disciples from the House of Swords to be able to become the inheritor of the House of Swords. Your Blade sect is truly terrifying. My father won't face any danger from joining the Blade sect, right? When she heard of the tradition to compete for position in the Blade sect, Feng Tianwu's beautiful face went pale and she asked with slight fear. Of course not. Suli laughed bitterly. It's only the competition for the position as master in the House of Swords and House of Sabers that's comparatively tragic. Normally, the disciples of the House of Sabers are harmonious with each other. Moreover, the House of Swords is almost the same as well. The disciples of the House of Sabers are harmonious with each other? The disciples of the House of Swords are almost the same. Zhang Xiaoyang smiled spuriously. Based on what you said, there seemed to be something wrong between the disciples of the House of Swords and House of Sabers. Actually, there's nothing wrong. According to my master, it's just that both are unconvinced of each other's strength, so there would occasionally be some competition and friction between both sides. Suli spoke with slight embarrassment. He'd found out slightly about the situation in Blade Sect, yet he himself wasn't so clear about it. You call that nothing wrong? Duan Lingtian couldn't help but roll his eyes at Suli. In his heart, he fairly approved of the management method of keeping the House of Swords and House of Sabers independent. As for the sanguinary competition in the House of Swords and House of Sabers for the position of master of the respective houses, he didn't feel anything was wrong with it. The Cloud Continent was a world where the strong were respected, and if one wanted to become an extraordinary figure, there would naturally be no lack of hardships and dangers. Only by traversing through these layer upon layer of hardships and dangers would one truly stand at the peak. This was something that Duan Lingtian felt strongly about. Because he possessed the 2 lifetimes worth of memories of the rebirth martial emperor, whereas, the rebirth martial emperor had walked step by step to achieve the accomplishments he attained in those 2 lifetimes and became a martial emperor stage expert that stood at the peak of Cloud Continent in the end. Suli, in this way, If you want to compete for the position of Master of the House of Swords in the future, then you have to undergo a sanguinary competition with another 17 outstanding disciples of the House of Swords. Suddenly, Duan Lingtian thought of this, and his brows knit tightly as he was worried for Suli. Yes. Suli nodded. This is the normal process. Of course, Master isn't forcing me to go compete to become the Master of the House of Swords. Senior is really good to you. Duan Lingtian smiled. After chatting idly for some time, Duan Lingtian's group of 3 bid their farewells to Suli before leaving the herbaceous peony pavilion. After he returned to the Narcissus pavilion, Duan Lingtian didn't return to his room but stayed outside the pavilion instead as he earnestly cultivated the high-grade heaven-rank martial skill, 9 Dragons Radiant Flash. After the series of encounters from earlier, Duan Lingtian's state of mind had been changing constantly, and he'd long since forgotten the feelings he had from cultivating the 9 Dragons Radiant Flash earlier. So when he cultivated it once again now, he didn't have that feeling of desiring speed yet achieving nothing. Swoosh! Swoosh! Duan Lingtian's fingers formed into a sword and struck out, and then 2 divine dragons condensed from origin energy bared their fangs and brandished their claws as they whistled out. The comparatively more material divine dragon amongst the 2 suddenly shot out 2 flashes from its eyes. Swish! Swish! The flashes tore through the sky and flashed out with an extremely terrifying speed before striking onto the enormous rock outside the pavilion. During the past few days, Duan Lingtian had frequently cultivated the 9 Dragons Radiant Flash, so this enormous rock had long since been covered in holes. After cultivating for a while, Duan Lingtian stopped, and then he held the wind concept fragment as he meditated in cultivation. His wind concept improved ceaselessly. The incident that occurred today was very quickly tossed to the back of his mind by Duan Lingtian. In his world, only the wind concept that was like a meditating monk when silent and was like a frenzied rabbit when moving remained. Time slowly flowed by and the date the martial competition of the 10 dynasties began grew closer and closer. During these last 2 days, not a single young genius of the 10 dynasties left Skywolf Fort, and all of them seemed to have reached a tacit understanding to stay in their respective pavilions and cultivate. Every single one of them felt extremely great pressure. Perhaps they were considered to be extraordinary existences in their respective dynasties. But now, they weren't competing with only the young geniuses from the dynasties they were from, they were also competing with the young geniuses from another 9 dynasties. Even if one was the number 1 expert in the younger generation of one's dynasty, one wouldn't dare say that one would surely be stronger than the young geniuses of the other 9 dynasties. In the blink of an eye, the day before the martial competition of the 10 dynasties began had arrived. Dusk descended and the setting sun was blood red, causing the entire Skywolf Fort to seem as if it was tainted with blood, and it looked to be extremely magnificent and beautiful. Time has really flowed quickly. The martial competition of the 10 dynasties is tomorrow. Duan Lingtian leaned on the pavilion's balcony as he looked at the red glow that covered the sky and muttered. He'd already made his preparation to welcome the competition between the young geniuses of the 10 dynasties tomorrow. Big Brother Duan. Suddenly, Duan Lingtian saw Feng Tianwu flying over from afar, and he was instantly slightly surprised. Tianwu, where did you go? Big Brother Duan, I went to inquire about the rules in the first round of the martial competition tomorrow. Feng Tianwu smiled mysteriously. I hope you enjoy the video, don't forget like, share, subscribe to channels.